episode 13 of After the Breach, a podcast for whale enthusiasts. We are your hosts, Jeff Friedman and Sara Shimazu, joining you from Friday Harbor, Washington. We are professional whale watch captains and guides with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching here in Friday Harbor, and today we are joined by Monika Wieland Shields from Orca Behavior Institute. We're going to follow up on our conversation from last episode that we had on Type D killer whales and their low genetic diversity by talking about another paper on this topic, but this one focused on populations in the Northeast Pacific region, including the populations we see here, southern resident killer whales and Bigg's killer whales. But before that, we're going to get into some of the latest sightings that we've had out here because it has been absolutely incredible. Hi, Sara. Hi, Monika.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Hey.
It's going great. We've had some incredible sightings. Let's kick this off. Sara, if you want to talk a little bit about, we had an all-day tour last weekend on Sunday and had a very large group of Bigg's killer whales, including a new baby.
Yeah. We got up north, way far north. I think, Jeff, we decided it was our second longest trek north for an all-day trip, and found 19 Bigg's killer whales up there. And I think originally the report was 2.
The original report from the ferry, there was a report from the BC ferry of 2 killer whales that quickly multiplied into 19.
Yeah, impressive how they multiply. But, I mean, that's kind of the theme with this population. So, yeah, a great group with the T36As, the T124As, T125A, T128, the list goes on, T124C, T49A1.
And the T65Bs.
Of course, can't forget them.
Yeah, so we've talked about the 65As quite a bit on our podcast. This is the 65Bs, so it's 65A's sister, 65B, and her now 3 kids.
Yeah, brand new calf. Well, not brand new, but new to us. First time being seen was that day, so that was awesome. I was
really impressed that you and April were able to spot the new calf in the mix of 19 killer whales all bunched together. And you're like, I think the 65Bs are here, and I think there's a new calf.
Well, it was really little compared to all the other littles, but I think what was cool was in that group of 19 whales, we had 5 whales that were 2 or younger. So more than 25% of that group was under the age of 3, 2.5 or less.
Which is becoming more common when we see these big groups of multiple families. There's so many young killer whales in the Bigg's population that when you see these aggregations of multiple families, you're going to have a large percentage of them under the age of 10 for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's like a third of the population.
That's
the coastal population is under the age of 10.
It's amazing. Monika, you put out a graphic that I would love to share in our show notes about the number of Bigg's killer whales under the age of 10 versus southern resident killer whales, the endangered fish-eating killer whales. And it's when you see it in a graphic, it's really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talk about the numbers, but the visual is remarkable for sure. And the fact that we have almost twice as many Bigg's killer whales under the age of 10 as we have southern resident killer whales.
Yeah, it's remarkable what's happening in their population.
Yeah, and the big groups, we've just seen more and more big groups. Like I know, 10 years ago we were kind of seeing like, between 3 and 5, and now it's not uncommon. I mean, Monika, you probably agree. Like when we get a report 10 years ago, if we got a report of a big group of killer whales, it was like automatically going to be southern residents. And now it's like, well, which one is it?
Absolutely.
It could be either.
I know that was a big tell before, right? Like if somebody saw just a couple killer whales, it was almost always Bigg's. And if they saw 15 plus killer whales, we assumed residents. And now it's funny, it's actually often the opposite. It's the reports of 1 or 2 killer whales make me think sometimes are spread out southern residents foraging somewhere. So you really can't go off the numbers at all anymore.
No, not at all. And it's been an amazing spring. We have had J-pod sightings, here and there. They've been spending a lot more time up north, but we have had some sightings down here and down in Puget Sound. And then all the way up to Campbell River. But it has been an amazing spring. I mean, we're seeing killer whales on well over 80% of our tours, and we're seeing them sometimes when we're out on the water, not on a tour. I think you two have some great stories to share from last night, just right outside of Friday Harbor.
Well, it was a great whale day all around, Jeff, because you had some pretty amazing sightings in the morning.
Yes, we did have a really interesting trip in the morning. We were with the T46s and T46Bs, and another new baby in that group, T46B7. Unfortunately, T46 has not been seen the last few days that the 46 and 46Bs have been around. So I think it's probably safe to assume she is no longer.
Well, I mean, we'll hold out hope, right?
Yeah,
we haven't seen the 46B1s, but yeah, typically she's seen with.
I mean, you never know, right? You never
know.
know. She could be with the B1s, but definitely not typical to
Right.
not see her there with that part of the family. But it was an interesting trip because it was in the exact same location that we saw them a few years ago when it was the first sighting of the 46Bs on B1s where Talook was no longer present. And exact same spot. I wouldn't say similar behavior, but both trips, like you just got a sense that there was something going on. Mm-hmm. They were very social yesterday, and they didn't move. They were in the same location pretty much all day. A lot of socializing going on in the family, and we'll definitely hold out hope for T46. But regardless, what a legacy!
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about this on the boat yesterday about we have some power families in the big killer whale population. That you have, a female that leaves this legacy of so many whales.
Yeah. And I think there's others that have, extended families, T124, that kind of line itself. But I don't know of any other one that kind of like strikes me as much as T46 does. Like I got a little teary when I heard she wasn't there the other day, but, even with like all the other families that have these extensive groups, none hit quite so hard as T46.
I think part of that is probably the fact that she was captured for the marine park industry and released before she was removed from a sea pen down in Puget Sound. And that we can trace, I think it's 23 whales that we can, somewhere around there, it's in the 20s that can be traced back to her that wouldn't exist had she gone into a marine park. And with these other power families, I don't know that it doesn't hit the same, I think, because it's not that same backstory.
Right.
Yeah, she's definitely legendary for being the last living whale from the last live capture in Washington State back in 1976. And she's a whale that I point to all the time as what difference a single reproductive female can make if she's successful. And just to be clear, she herself doesn't have 20 or so offspring.
Right.
But she has, multiple sons and daughters, and her daughters have been successful in now 4 generations.
Yeah, she's a great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother, yeah. So, I point to her as an example when we're talking about the southern residents and potential hope for their future, that, you have 1 or 2 females like that are that reproductively successful and have that many, reproductive descendants, and it can change things around for the population.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we'll probably get to this later too, because the flip side of that, and I was talking about this on the boat on our tour yesterday, the other side of that is you look at all the whales that were captured and all especially the female killer whales that were removed from these waters, and how many whales that could have been from just 1 or 2 of those whales that, had they not been captured, how many more offspring and grand offspring and great grandkids there could have been.
Yeah.
It's very much a part of the ongoing story of the southern residents, and it plays into the inbreeding research as well, the captures and the animals that were removed.
Yeah, we will definitely get into that, and can't wait to hear your take on that paper, Monika. But I can't let the last night's story go, because I wasn't there when you two had the stellar sea lion hunt going on right in front of the harbor, and there was a young whale in that, one of our new growing favorite young whales.
And kind of speaking of deja vu, like to you having this experience with the 46s and 46Bs in the same spot that they were after Tuluk, was no longer with them. We had a very similar encounter on August 31st last year. Monika, you were out there. We were a different boat last time, but it was the same families in the same spot hunting a stellar sea lion, and Galliano breached 3 times, and it was kind of windy. Like
the coveted Galliano breach.
Yeah. So we had the the T18s and the T49As without T49A1 and A2 last night, right outside of Friday Harbor. And unlike last year's sea lion hunt, which was successful after less than an hour, these guys were giving this sea lion a hard time for, I think, at least 4 hours across all the different people that were observing it. And as of sunset last night, sea lion was still alive.
Yeah, because I think it started before we got off the dock, about 4:30, and at 8:30, I think it was still going strong from what some people still on the water were saying. But it was cool. It was a very interesting hunt. Like, I think we both agree, like, probably training some of the younger animals, T49A4 and T49A5 seemed to take a big part in kind of the main assault, I guess. But it was periods of like activity, and then they would like call a timeout, like break, catch each other's breath, and then go back in for it.
That was amazing to witness, where the whales were like clearly almost resting at the surface, and the sea lion kind of catching its breath too. And then somebody, waved the flag, and it was go time again. And there's some kind of mutual understanding of what the rules of engagement are in that, right? Like the sea lion didn't try to make a break for it then. It was just everybody paused and then everybody resumed.
Yeah, it was interesting. I thought for sure, like, when those kayakers came in, I was a little worried. I was a little worried that like the sea lion was going to see that kayak and try to like make a break for it. I was
nervous at that moment as well.
Yeah, but it did not.
It sounds incredible. And where was Charlie in all this?
Right in the middle of it.
Really?
Not very effective, but right in the middle of it. Well, maybe he or she was effective.
Well, if you asked T49A6, I think he or she would say they were the one calling the shots and giving the sea lion a run for its money there. That little one was right in the thick of it the entire time. Some other whales kind of came in and out of the sort of the main engagement, but
lots of tail slapping and little half breaches and that kind of thing.
That's incredible. And I did see your photo of both your photos of Galliano breaching, and we'll post that in the show notes. That is a very coveted shot.
It was a loud one too. I think you mentioned that in your photo caption, Monika. But when he hits the water,
any adult male breach is an epic sight to behold. But T19B seems to be a particularly coveted one. But the sound of that, and I think it had to do in part, he had his pecs, which are massive. He had them completely splayed out to the side, and so the sound of those hitting the water, I mean, it was like being right underneath a fireworks show.
Yeah, the male pec fins are, I mean, they're huge. What's the size? I mean, to me, they look like it's the size of a queen bed.
I think they can get like 6 feet, and cross or long, or they're almost square in some cases,
Yeah, I mean, incredible. It must have been, I mean, who knows? Maybe it's even still going on right out in front.
I went down and had a cup of coffee this morning, and I kind of like.
I was wondering if anyone checked this morning. Yeah.
I wonder if the sea lion is just like, man, I hate being part of these training sessions.
Could be.
Well, I made the comment on the boat. If 9 big killer whales came up to me as a sea lion, I would say, like, just take me now.
I don't drag it out this long.
I don't know if I want to encage for 4 hours with that type of.
Or like, I would have a heart attack. Like
No,
I would die of fright.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
Yeah, well, and I think it was last week we had the two Alaskan boys traveling with the 137s up Sansom Narrows, and we saw two unsuccessful sea lion hunts.
Yeah.
But in this case, one was probably about 30 to 45 minutes, and then the sea lion ended up on getting out of the water onto a beach, and they moved on to another sea lion, and it was maybe 10 minutes, and they
were tired.
Yeah, they just moved on. Not something, usually in my experience of seeing them, they're usually successful.
Yeah.
But obviously there are a lot
I think
that we don't see.
I think T49A and T19 have some stamina. Like,
No kidding. They were the two females that appeared to be in there with the juveniles the entire
whole time.
And they were at least, I think, helping to keep the sea lion corralled. But
right.
Well, and T18 is no slouch.
No.
A few years ago, I think this is probably 3 or 4 years ago now, there was a minke chase
With T65B.
with T65B, and T18 were the two in front that almost caught up to the minke, and it was T18, I think, who was the lead whale.
Yeah.
And so she's got some stamina for her age.
Yeah.
You might think the adult males are the key ones when they're taking down these larger prey items, right? But like in last night's hunt, the three oldest males were mostly on the periphery.
Just like being like, I'm hungry, hurry it up.
Yeah, there was a lot of surface activity, peck slaps, tail slaps, those 3 breaches.
Yeah.
It seemed like they were ready for dinner, but
I feel like that's kind of not typical, but typical. Like in these hunts, I often see like the males kind of hang out on the outskirts, and the female and younger whales doing a lot of the work.
Yeah, I think that's right from what I've seen. It's usually the older females that are in the middle of it, and a lot of times especially the adult males are just out there waiting to get fed.
And you can't tell me they can't hunt for themselves, because like there's these
independent
males that do it just fine, right?
Well, and we don't see that survival relationship where if a male Biggs loses their mom, that they pass away the way we see with, southern residents. So I think they absolutely can fend for themselves.
Just choose not
but
to.
if mom's there,
right,
Mom, make me dinner.
Exactly. I mean, it's like going home for the weekend and bringing your laundry and just have mom take care of you.
Make some bagel bites.
So let's move on and talk about some of the results of this and interpretations of this paper.
Yeah. So last episode we talked with Jared Towers from Base Etology about the recent publication on the Type D orcas and their kind of low genetic diversity. But late last month, another paper was published in, I think it was Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, called Inbreeding Depression Explains Killer Whale Population Dynamics. And those researchers were focused on killer whale populations, here kind of in the eastern North Pacific, and a lot of that kind of specifically focused on the southern resident killer whales. So, Monika, you gave a great presentation the other day kind of explaining this paper. So if you don't mind, 1, thanks for joining us again, and 2, I'll hand it over to you, kind of tell us a little bit about what the paper was saying.
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying I'm not part of this study. I just dove into this paper, as I do with any paper on the southern residents, to try and understand it. And I'm also not a geneticist, though I did take a few genetics classes. But I think even without that, while the methods on some of these papers can be really hard to delve into, I think the take-home messages and kind of the overall research is still really important and really understandable. And so this study was all about inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression is defined as reduced biological fitness that results from breeding between related individuals. So we may carry copies of genes that are not beneficial to our survival, but when we breed with relatives, those genes are more likely to be expressed. And this is a pretty common concept in biology, although with wild populations of animals especially, it's been very much theoretical. It's something that's studied more in captive populations and in agriculture. So this study was a unique opportunity in that they have so many genetic samples from, in this case, 100 southern resident killer whales, both living and deceased. And they can, test some of these genetics theories in this living population where we have samples from all these different individuals, and we know the relationships between these individuals. And the real take-home message from this paper, their primary finding was that both males and females were less likely to reach age 40 if they have a higher inbreeding coefficient, so are the product of a crossbreeding between related individuals. And while each year to year, the chance of survival, didn't decrease that much, they said that for females with a high inbreeding coefficient were 64% less likely to reach age 40, and for males up to 78% less likely to reach age 40. So their big conclusion was that southern resident killer whales and their lack of population recovery is due at least in part to this genetic lack of genetic diversity that they have. And in particular, lack of genetic diversity compared to other populations in the Northeast Pacific, including offshores, the Bigg killer whales, and northern and Alaska resident killer whales, which have all been increasing in population.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in this. And I'll jump in here because I think the paper mentions this, and we just talked about it, was the removal of so many killer whales from the southern resident population during the marine park captures, and the long-term impacts that we may be seeing now in their genetic diversity.
Yeah, one thing that can lead to inbreeding depression is a population bottleneck where you have fewer breeding individuals in the population. And while all populations were potentially, affected by the live captures, we know northern residents and Bigg killer whales were removed as well. The southern residents were most strongly impacted, with up to maybe a third of their population either removed or killed during the capture era. And it essentially removed almost an entire breeding generation. And so we have already small killer whale population sizes in this region. And then we put additional pressure on this, smallest of the populations, has potentially exacerbated the inbreeding problem for these whales.
Well, and the other thing that jumps out at me, I mean, to some degree, I mean, we're dealing with all these different populations that are all relatively small, not quite as small, I think, as the southern residents are probably one of the smaller ones, especially now. But it's just interesting to juxtapose this with the last week's conversation or last episode's conversation with Jared Towers on the type Ds, who seem to be even more inbred, hit a bottleneck much longer ago. And we don't think, or Jared's take was, he doesn't think that that is necessarily impacting their population, which may give us some hope as well for the southern residents.
Yeah, super interesting to have these papers come out back to back and kind of telling potentially different stories. Of course, we know so little about type D killer whales. We don't know much about their population size or population trajectory, but the genetic evidence does suggest that they've been highly inbred and had this high, what they call inbreeding coefficient for a long time and seemingly doing okay. The concern with the southern residents by comparison is that we know from this study that it is linked to reduced survival. So there's, we're not just saying, they have these higher inbreeding coefficients, but with the southern resident population specifically, we're seeing that there is a, potential direct relationship between that and the population decline.
And there are other factors as well that are leading to their population decline that just compound this.
Absolutely. This is by no means saying, that this is the reason that they haven't recovered. It's also not saying that they don't have the potential to recover, but it's just kind of another piece of the puzzle and another hurdle that they are facing, that they're maybe at a little bit more of a disadvantage than some other populations that have greater genetic diversity.
So with the inbreeding and the low genetic diversity, what is a fix for that? How can that, is there a way to reduce that impact or increase their genetic diversity?
Yeah, it's not really something we have any control over, right? We can't set up a cross-population killer whale dating program.
Open bar, disco.
Tinder for whales.
Yeah.
But if there are any outbreeding events with other populations, even if they are rare, that sort of injection of new genetic material to the population can make a big difference, even if it doesn't occur very often. And they do say in this paper there's no evidence of that within the last 1 to 2 generations, but that doesn't mean that it never occurs. And they actually alluded to possibly having some evidence of crossbreeding between northern residents and Alaskan resident killer whales. And it's one of the topics that they want to investigate further is as you sample more of the population, you may be able to get a sense of if and how often these type of crossbreeding events occur. And if something like that were to happen with a southern resident killer whale, it could really help lower these inbreeding coefficients over time across the entire population.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and man, can I be wrong, but I recall either a talk, I think it was a talk years ago, that there was one southern resident that the paternity suggested that it might have not been a southern resident. Did that ever get resolved? Like, do we know anything more? Do you remember that, or am I just making that up in my head?
I remember that theory floating around. And there's, with genetics, it's kind of the more data we gather, the more we learn. And sometimes we end up throwing out some of the things that we thought we knew before. So I don't think that's been substantiated. I think there was maybe a question of that at one point, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that that was the case. And then their explicit claim in this paper that they have not seen it within the last 2 generations makes me think there's no known outbreeding within the southern residents.
But this paper did have some interesting paternity results that we hadn't seen before.
It did, yeah. For those of us who know these whales as individuals, it's super interesting to dive into the supplemental information that's also published alongside these papers because it reveals some of the crossbreedings that did occur and paternity results, which we all find super interesting. And there had been 2 previous papers that had looked at southern resident killer whale genetics and inbreeding, both published in 2011 and 2018. And one of those papers had suggested, for example, that J1 might be the offspring of L45. And that now has been removed from their updated pedigree in this paper.
Interesting.
Suggesting that maybe that was, that wasn't something they confirmed at that point. It was just a possibility, but that seems like that has now been walked back a little bit.
Huh.
I think there was a lot of info, interesting info in the paternity and the supplemental and info. And I think one of the things I'd love to get your take on, because I have always assumed, and I think it's just an intuitive assumption to make, that crossbreeding between J's and K's or J's and L's or crossbreeding between pods is better because it would be better for genetic diversity, and that we're seeing the 3 pods spending less and less time together, and we're assuming that that's not good for their genetic diversity and breeding. But there's some info in the supplemental info that contradicts that.
Yeah, it all depends on the relationship between the parents, right? And they could be half siblings from different pods,
right? That
if they then mate, still will have relatively inbred offspring. So we have examples of whales like J51, who this study shares was fathered by K26. So J51 would be the offspring then of J41 and K26. Yet he's among the 10 southern resident killer whales with the highest inbreeding coefficient. So here's an example of a crossbreeding between pods that still resulted in a high individual inbreeding coefficient. But we have other known, relationships that maybe don't result in this higher inbreeding coefficient. So, for example, we know that J1 and J28 were the parents of J46, and so a father-daughter breeding, but she is not among the most inbred individuals, despite being the offspring of known relatives within the same pod. So we really can't say just based on who the parents are, who the most inbred individuals are. They really have to look at the entire genome and what they call these runs of homozygosity, which sort of indicate the level of inbreeding and sort of the historic relationship between, the genetic lines that resulted in that individual.
Yeah, and I think what also was interesting about the top 10 highest individuals with the highest inbreeding coefficient was L25 for me. So here's a whale that's, was born before this capture era. We're estimating 1928, I think, is the estimate for her birth year, but she was on the list of top 10.
That's the one that I really circled as well, because of the fact that she preceded the capture era. That really suggests to me that perhaps the southern residents have had this higher inbreeding coefficient for longer. That it's not simply a result of the capture era, which we know that resident killer whale populations have pretty small breeding populations anyway. So yeah, interesting for sure. They do this comparison between the southern residents and primarily the Alaskan residents, because they didn't have many northern resident killer whale samples in here. And the southern residents with the lowest inbreeding coefficient are on par with kind of the Alaskan resident killer whales, which has been an increasing population. Another result from the study said, well, if all the southern residents had sort of that lower inbreeding coefficient on par with Alaskan residents, what would happen over the next 100 years? And their modeling shows that the population would be likely to increase. Whereas if all the southern residents had these higher inbreeding coefficients of, the more inbred individuals like J42 and J51, that the population, all other factors being held the same, would be likely to continue to decline over the next 100 years. So again, that heightened overall inbreeding coefficient is playing a role. And even though sometimes the numbers are pretty slight compared to the Alaskan population, it seems to be enough to lead to this different population trajectory.
And it's all fascinating, and it just makes me realize that the more we find out, the less we really know, because we really don't know how, well, like with the type Ds, if they're so inbred, our intuition is like, well, their population must be doing horribly, but we can see that they've been inbred for a long period of time.
Right.
And on the other side of this is we can do this modeling of their population of what will happen if the genetics do this or the diversity does that. But the bottom line is without large wild Chinook and rewilding rivers, their population trajectory is not going to increase. Regardless, they could go outbreeding all they want. Without food, their trajectory is going to continue to decline.
Yeah, it comes down to the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we look at the southern resident killer whale population in the 1990s, the inbreeding coefficients were more or less the same, but the population was increasing. So they're certainly capable of having an increased population, but the difference between the 1990s and today is the environmental factors of what they were dealing with. There were more fish then.
Bigger fish.
Yep.
Yeah, I think and it would be great to get some people on an episode talking about salmon, because I think one of the things that we overlook sometimes is it's not just the number of fish, but it really comes down to their size.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the take home from this, NOAA had a scientific briefing on this paper, and so we were all really interested to hear what's their messaging around this, because NOAA scientists were, participants in this research. Are they trying to write off the southern resident killer whales, by saying, oh, they're genetically doomed? But that is not at all the case. The scientists involved and the managers that are responsible for, trying to recover this population all really had the same message, that this is another piece of information that we need to consider, but that it just, further underscores the importance of doing all the other things that we can to help them recover. So nobody is saying this is it for the southern residents. This is just another hurdle that they face, and further underscores the importance of making sure that they have enough food so that this, whatever genetically is leading to the decreased survival that comes along with inbreeding is supported by them at least having enough to eat to increase chance of survival.
Right. I mean, the more food they get, the more they will reproduce, and the more they reproduce, and the more viable calves that come out will help, hopefully increase some of the genetic diversity, and they get through this bottleneck, and it doesn't continue to impact them.
Yeah, one thing we don't know at this point is what specifically, what genes are leading to this reduced survival. Is it something related to the immune system or something related to fertility, or what is it? We don't have that level of genetic knowledge yet, but we know that things like having enough to eat help boost your immune system and, make you more likely to have successful pregnancies and that sort of thing. So we can support them in other ways to maybe help overcome whatever is going on among these inbred individuals that is making them less likely to survive.
It's going to be interesting to see what the follow-ups are in terms of genetic studies and how much more we're able to learn. It's going to be fascinating. And I think each step of the way, it's going to be the same thing. It's like, okay, now we know this, but now we don't know all this.
Well, we don't know this, and I have so many more questions now.
I really hope, as we continue doing these comparisons with other populations, I'm really hoping that one piece that comes out of this down the road is some paternity insights on the Bigg's killer whales, because
yeah,
right, we have so much speculation and we know nothing at this point.
So speaking of the Bigg's killer whales, one of the things that was in this paper that literally sent my jaw to the floor was the population size estimates that were in this paper, and that I think it was somewhere around 100 generations ago that the Biggs may have had 3,000 to 4,000 breeding whales.
Yeah. So what they did is
what?
Yeah, they look at effective population size, which basically means how many individuals in the population are breeding, and that's smaller than the total population size, but doing, genetics and their mathematics, they can kind of project back in time what may have happened. And the resident killer whale populations, were larger in the past, but still relatively small. But they found this, kind of remarkable result that among the Bigg's killer whales, it looked like the population may have been many thousands of individuals larger than today, which is possible. Another explanation for it is that maybe there was more crossbreeding between Biggs and other populations at that time, making it look like it was kind of a larger functional breeding population, even if it wasn't all Bigg's killer whales. But that to me is kind of in contrast with what we've heard before about the Biggs being more genetically distinct than other populations. So I think there's, again, a lot of unknowns there, but definitely suggests that there were some interesting things going on in the Bigg's killer whale population one way or another, as recently as what they're calling, 100 killer whale generations ago, which is not that long, less than 1,000 years, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I just can't even imagine. I mean, it's amazing to see their population today and how big it's getting and how fast it's growing. Mm-hmm. I don't think when this baby boom started was like 2012, and we really started to get in tune with that. I don't think anybody had expected it was still going to be going on in 2023, and yet in the last week or so we've seen two new calves, and have had many in the last year. Mm-hmm. And I guess on the flip side of what we're talking about with Southern Residents is it shows what is possible when you have a very abundant supply of food.
And that's what we talk, I know you do, Jeff, because I've heard you talk about it. And I know, Monika, you talk about it as well, is like we have these two very different population trajectories with whales that use the same area, and the ones that are doing well are here more often. They have higher toxin levels, because they feed higher on the trophic level, and they're doing exceedingly well for a killer whale population in this day and age. And it's because of that. It's because they have enough food to eat. I think they're doing exceedingly well for any most
population,
populations
for
these days, right?
Any kind of wild animal. They're doing phenomenally well. Yeah. So it is fascinating to see the juxtaposition of the two populations. And we, again, we've been seeing so many killer whales out there, bigs especially. And Monika, what's upcoming for Orca Behavior Institute this field season?
Well, it's tough to predict what's going to happen in the field, right? It seems like we have some surprises every year. We had kind of gotten used to not having the southern residents around in the spring, and now J-pods may be sticking around at least later than usual, so we're hoping to continue seeing them. An exciting development for us is we're in the process of getting a new hydrophone installed in North San Juan Channel that will be live streaming on the Orca Sound hydrophone network. So we're super excited to see what sort of acoustic range it has from that location and what kind of things we're picking up on that hydrophone, especially there's just been a big super highway, it seems like, over the last couple of weeks. It's been hard not to have that hydrophone online yet, but we will see. And then on the research side of things, we're working on crunching a lot of our behavioral data on both populations of killer whales and seeing what kind of our first few years of research might reveal. So lots of exciting stuff ahead.
That's awesome. And you're going to be out on the water a bit this summer.
Yep, that's the plan. We plan to get our boat back in the water here in the next couple days and see what the season has in store for us.
We'll definitely have to have you back on at the end of your field season and see what kind of stuff you've come up with. It's always great to have you on.
It's always great to be here. Fun to chat with you guys.
And we're going to be we're running tours every day with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching, and we have a special After the Breach photo workshop coming up this fall. If you are interested in joining us, definitely reach out. Sara has the dates for us.
Yeah, it's going to be September 23rd and 24th, a Saturday and Sunday. And people can sign up for both days. They can sign up for one day. It'll be fully catered. But we're going to go out for, between 6 and 8 hours. Jeff and I like to run on the longer end of things and see what we can find out there. And that time of year is just amazing. Big killer whales for sure, but huge aggregations of humpback whales as well.
Yeah, always a potential at that time of year where we get these aggregations of 50, 70 plus humpbacks feeding in the same area. And it's so hard to imagine and describe, but I mean, blows as far as you can see and just humpbacks everywhere in some glassy water. Always a chance of seeing killer whales at that time of year as well. And we usually have some really nice weather days.
It's our favorite month.
So yeah, these are going to be all day tours with Sara and I, and some catering and some photo instruction and ID instruction.
Yep.
So if you're interested, send us an email to afterthebreachpodcast@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Instagram at afterthebreach. And
and we'll talk to you soon. Stay safe out there.
Stay safe out there.